Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. The last time I talked politics with Vincent Montalbano, it was just after the 2016 election, and we weren't very happy. We especially talked about the 49% of union members who voted for Trump and how to get them back into the Democratic Party. Now we've got that chance to do that. I want to know what he thinks the odds are. So he's my guest. Welcome.
Thank you, Ronnie.
Good. So, you know, we were talking about what's going to mobilize people into interest more after this election. And I think Trump is the catalyst, right?
Well, Trump is certainly the main catalyst.
Right.
That I would say that's true.
Yeah.
But part of the concern I have is that we're paying a lot of attention to Trump and the things he's putting on the agenda, and many times getting our own agenda lost, and that's not good.
I think we're getting a little better about that, though. I think everybody's getting a little tired. I mean, I hope they do. I don't know. I hope Biden shifts from the anti-Trump stuff to himself, and I think he does. But first, let's talk about the unions.
Sure.
So they lost 49% of their members?
Well, that's what a lot of the statistical indicators were from last time, and it's always been in the high 30s, low 40s. Last time was much larger. And
they've always been enrolled Democrats that crossed the line?
Well, no, not necessarily. Okay. Remember, these are general elections we're talking about. That doesn't, many of them could be Republicans.
Yeah.
But I mean, the issue is that the unions need to be organized internally to make sure that the members understand what's in their best interest when they go to vote politically.
And are they doing anything about it?
Yes, they are, actually.
Let's talk about the labor movement for a while.
Okay. I listened to your intro, and I actually do feel better about some of the things that are happening with labor. The Supreme Court Janus decision of a year and a half ago, which basically said among public employees that if you didn't want to belong to the union, you also didn't have to pay that portion of what were dues to support the services that you get. So basically, you would be able to be freeloading.
And that meant no health insurance from the union?
Well, no, it meant that they get the services, but they don't have to pay for them.
Okay.
They don't have to pay for representation, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay,
but they would have to get it anyway. Now, what the unions have done in many places, I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I know here in New York, the public employee unions really then went to work internally, talking to their members, making sure that they knew it was important for them to be members of the union at the best, or at least to pay the fees necessary to carry the union, and they've ended up increasing their membership.
Why did they tell them that it's important?
Because it is important, because unions, that's what the word means. It's a union of people, of organized people who are there for a purpose, who support each other, who support the goals and the needs of the members.
Is the tradition still there that your experience with unions, that your father was a member of the union, your mother? Are you brought up with the same kind of union spirit we used to have?
Look, I think a lot of that still exists. But I do think it's undeniable that the labor movement has it's lost members, sometimes out of no fault of their own, because businesses have closed, budget cuts have decimated membership, but that they have not. They've paid a lot more attention to politics than they have to the members. I think this Supreme Court decision jolted them out of that. And I think they have been successful, at least over this last year, in bringing back members. And that's what's necessary. It is an undeniable fact. Even conservatives will admit to the fact that labor union workers get paid better than non-labor union workers. So it is a good thing to have a union. It's important to have a union.
Right.
But the unions have to make sure that the members feel that they're getting what they deserve, and I think that they have done better at that in the last couple of years.
And it's also involved because, as you said, businesses are closing down, things are getting tougher, so your work availability isn't as great, and your incomes are lower. So there we have it with all the discussion about what happens to people who are working people, who depend on the old system we have.
Well, there's another problem, and that is that you know, we all look at the New Deal and at FDR and what he did to strengthen the labor unions.
Those of us old enough to know.
Yes, I'm not old enough for the New Deal, but I read about it a lot. Oh. But the Wagner Act, you know, from the late 40s, early 50s, really diluted a lot of that. So that it is very easy now, unfortunately, very easy for unions that want to organize, that the companies are able to defeat them. And there are things that can be done to level that playing field. One of them is something called card check, where if you get a majority of members to sign a card, there doesn't have to be an election. And they can have their
Don't some of the candidates support that?
I think, in terms of the Democrats, I think probably all of them do.
I think by now, it used to be such a revolutionary or controversial thing. Now it's pretty much accepted.
But supporting it, Ronnie, and getting it done are two different things. And in fact, there was legislation in the beginning of the Obama administration, before the Republicans took control of both houses, to do that. And it never made it through because of all of the horse trading and et cetera.
Which brings us back to your other basic point, which is campaign financing.
Campaign finance reform has always been a
But the unions aren't necessarily totally supportive of that, especially the PACs, right?
Well,
I don't know.
No, they're not. I mean, I think they're not going to unilaterally
right now they
dissolve.
need it because they have to respond to the other people who use it.
I think, and I have advocated, both in terms of my discussions with union leaders and in terms of things that I've written, I've advocated for the unions to actually get in the forefront of campaign finance reform for this reason. The real power of the unions, the real value of the unions is in their members, not in their money. Unions spend a lot of money on campaigns, but they are never going to match.
You're right.
The business establishment, they're never going to match that. What they do have that nobody else can match is members. And that's why I've always talked about what I call internal organizing, keeping the members engaged and involved, giving them a role, making them feel as if the union is their representative.
That's so right, because as a candidate, your contributions, if you're an average candidate, I'm not necessarily talking about president, but if you're running for the House, I don't think their contribution makes a big difference, but their workers and their election day operation and all their members, that's what makes the enormous difference.
Because the contribution limit is the same.
Yeah.
For them or for anybody else. But no, you're absolutely right. Having the members organized and active and engaged is what the power of the unions are. And that's why they should get in front of it. Look, maybe they'll come to that conclusion at some point in time. But for now, at this stage, making sure that their members know what they will gain if one set of people, which I think are the Democrats, should be in office, and what they will lose if Donald Trump and the Republicans stay in office. The members need to know that so that we can bring that 49% number way down.
Well, what evidence do they have that it helps them with Trump?
You're asking me what evidence they have? I don't think they have much evidence at all. And I think they're starting to come to, I'm talking about union members or people who work are starting to come to that conclusion.
Yeah.
But the Democrats, there are, all the candidates support, all the Democratic candidates support unions. There's no question about it. There are basically two of them who really have specific labor-oriented proposals and programs that are more extensive than others, and that's Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders.
Well, that's because they see the overall economy, right, and the
in both of their cases,
the lack of equality or lack of any moderation between. But he says they say the top 1%. It's less than 1%.
It's 1/10 of 1% is what we're talking about. But it's a messaging problem as much as anything else. My contention is that the Democratic candidates, all of them, should focus on family income security, economic security as their major issue. You know, Ronnie, we talk about that sometimes it's a problem for the Democratic Party to focus on social cultural issues, on what we call identity issues. But after years of looking at this stuff and being involved, you know, there's a simple thing that occurred to me, which is that there's really one unifying identity. And that unifying identity is work. Everybody works, or everybody wants to work, or everybody needs work. No matter what it is, that transcends all the other identities. It doesn't matter what your race is, what your ethnicity is, your gender is, your geographical location. And that's where the Democratic Party needs to look back to their New Deal roots. They have to look back to FDR, and they have to make that issue of income security go across the board. There's not an issue you can mention that I can't say to you, it would secure somebody's income if it was done right.
So are they, I mean, campaigning is also educating people.
Yes.
Do you think we're being successful at that, or is that getting lost?
Well, we meaning
the candidates.
The candidates?
I have to separate, frankly, these days. I separate the candidates from the party.
Okay.
I don't know how much, you know, I'm not down on the party structure, but anyway.
I'm with you.
Okay. So
yes,
it's their role, isn't it?
it is their role. It's absolutely their role. And I think some of them are doing that better than others. Certainly, Elizabeth Warren with her "I have a plan" thing is
Right.
it's not, you know, it's not lighthearted at all. It's very important, and she does have a plan. And most of them, by and large, do that. There are some who I don't think are doing as well. But yes, it is the job of the candidates. Bernie Sanders just this week put out a very large and two things: very large and comprehensive his Green New Deal plan, and a very large and comprehensive plan for strengthening labor unions and workers. You know, they're the same thing. We want them to be the same thing. So that's part of the education process. But for me, messaging is part of the education process. And I still maintain that the party as a whole and the candidates as a whole do not have a consistent message that appeals to that need of people to feel that they are secure.
That unfortunately always supposedly crystallizes at the convention with a platform, which has lost its significance.
Yes, the platform, yes.
And then you're only left with 2 months. I mean, this primary has started very early, it seems to me. Intensely early.
Yeah, I'm not sure
I don't
much
think that
earlier than the
Obama
last
was
one.
a year ago.
No, well,
They weren't, yeah.
Well, maybe not that far.
Right.
Yeah.
But I just wish that we could not have this. I don't know if I like this nominating system. When I certainly didn't like the old one, when, you know, the bosses would get together and decide, except that they had some very good perceptions about what kind of a candidate they wanted or needed. What do you say?
Well, look, you're right. I don't think we need to go back to bossism, but we do. In the union movement, we call it militancy, and that's not a negative thing. We're not talking about going out and, you know, with sticks and beating people. We're talking about having a strong and directed, militant way of organizing, and the Democratic Party doesn't have that very well, and they need to do that for their candidates and for their good, and they need to do it across states. You know, we have 50 state parties. We have a national party. They can do some things, but basically the state parties have most of the power. Now, the Republicans over the last 20 years, 25 years, noticed that and have gone in, strengthened their parties, and as you know, gone over and taken many state legislatures over to.
And then we have the redistricting, and then we have the uneven representation. But Howard Dean, for instance, had the idea. Well, you know, what did he have?
50-state strategy is
Right.
what he called it. Yeah.
Organize a party within each state. I don't think we've done that yet.
I don't.
We've done that comprehensively or very well in New York.
Well,
that's for sure.
I don't see that being publicized. That doesn't mean it's not being done behind the scenes. Although I did see something sometime in the last couple of days where the candidates, and I think this is good, this is militancy, the candidates have been asked to sign a pledge to the party, not,
To support it, yeah.
to support the state parties. And if they get elected to be president, that the administration will not set up their own parallel and separate authority. And you know what? That's good. That is good. You can't have a half dozen different
well, you
entities.
have a half a dozen different groups because the party doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
Well, and if
so, which comes first?
But I'm saying that
Yeah.
it looks like maybe
Yeah.
the party is getting that message by asking them to sign that.
Right. But let's talk a little bit about the other candidates. We haven't even talked about Joe Biden, but let's talk about candidate Yang.
Yang, okay.
He really is contributing to this debate.
He is contributing to the debate. He
Yeah.
very much is. And
Talk about why.
well, he's talking about something that people have not taken seriously until now, and that is the real threat. I think it's an existential threat if we don't do something about it, and so does he, about AI, artificial intelligence, and automation. And I actually wrote about this in one of my civil service chief
You're a
columns.
columnist.
I am an
in the
occasional
Chief,
columnist.
and they're really great.
Thank you very much. I enjoy them very much, and they're irregular, but they're based on some
And
issues
you're
that
lucky
concern
enough
me.
to do it when you want to do it.
And I'm lucky enough to do it.
And what's the title of it?
It's called My 2 Cents, which I remember when I was a kid, put my 2 cents in.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how much that's worth now. But the point is that we just have to, you don't do away with artificial intelligence. It's not going to happen. But what you do is you want to make sure that you control it so that it doesn't displace workers who then can't work. That doesn't make any sense because the ultimate end of that is you put everybody out of work.
Yeah.
So, and there are a variety of ideas, and he's put some of them forward and has really made them serious. I mean, for instance, there have been, and these are thinkers, these are philosophers, who talk about the fact that AI should be considered a worker. All right. So then that there should be a payroll tax, and there should be that the AI should pay into Social Security. So that basically you're not cutting away all the supports for the real human beings. All right. But the non-human beings essentially are contributing to the things that support work and make it work.
Does he tie that into his $1,000 a month contribution?
He does, yes, because you have to have some kind of guaranteed income program as part of your regulation of AI. And here's the interesting thing.
That's so interesting.
People say, oh, that's a socialist concept, that's a communist concept. Do you know who first talked about a guaranteed national income?
I do.
Richard Nixon.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon talked about it in terms of doing away with welfare payments on a local level and giving and determining what kind of that added up to, and giving people.
But he did that after McGovern did that, didn't he?
He did that when he did that when he was president.
McGovern was the first one to talk about a guaranteed minimum income.
You know what? Then you got me. I didn't realize.
Yeah.
It. I thought
that was a big thing when he ran.
Well,
very interesting. So he affected Nixon.
Yeah.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's and so but it's just a matter of we get off on these things. It's thisism, it's thatism. No. What we have to look at, and we'll get back to the candidates now. What they need to talk about is, again, how these issues tie in to how they affect real people and their ability to support themselves. Work is it. Work is everything. And we can't say, oh, there are winners and losers, like we have done with globalization. There are winners and losers. I hate that term. I can't stand that term. Who wants to be a loser? And why should you be a loser because some corporate entity took your job and brought it overseas?
Right.
That doesn't make you a loser.
Right.
That makes the government, which is the arbiter of society, the governor of society, that makes them lax and them deficient.
That collective sense has always been the basis of our country.
Yes, it has.
Yeah, you don't just individually do things. You just everything. I don't know. It's a more holistic approach that we've lost touch with.
I think that's true.
So you agree that the campaign should be about this important issue and not about Trump?
Absolutely.
Right.
I absolutely think we have paid too much attention to him. Look, and it's funny because these are all professional politicians with professional handlers who understand exactly what PR is and what messaging is. And you always want to control the message. Well, who's controlling the message here? Is it us or is it him?
Yeah.
He's controlling the message. You never let that happen. I mean, he will, given the opportunity, day in, day out, he will spill all kinds of stuff out there that you want to respond to. No, you don't want to respond to that. You really don't. Now, there are things you obviously have to respond to. The way children are treated, at the border, immigrant children, the gun control stuff. That's not, those are big issues. Those are ongoing issues. But to try and outdo him, to try and respond to everything is not a good strategy.
Very tiresome, too.
And it is, and it's not
and it always gets distorted anyway, right?
Yes. Yeah.
The election is a very important election because, as you said, the states are very important. And there are state elections,
yes,
I think. I don't know if that's all across the country, but certainly in a lot of the states.
Right.
And so it's, and the Senate and the House of Representatives. Mm-hmm. And the Senate is really a key, right? How do you account for the lack? Has there been a shift since you've been interested in politicians that have some kind of basic beliefs that they think they're in the government to help enact those? Mm-hmm. Or are they worried about their next election?
Oh, Ronnie, this is the best. This is the best question. I'm prepared to answer this because it's been something I've talked about for years. I think politics and public service should be a vocation, not a career.
Right.
Right. And just now in this presidential election, we've witnessed this, where there are candidates in there who, I don't want to say they have no business being in it, but who would have been better, and in some cases now they're thinking maybe they should, running in their states for an open Senate seat. But if you look at this as a if you don't look at it as a vocation, if you look at it as a vocation, then you say, you know what, I'm not going to be president. But to the legislature, which, by the way, Nancy Pelosi, God bless her, reminds us is Article 1 of the Constitution, okay? The executive is Article 2 of the Constitution. So people are running for president, that's Article 2, all right, not Article 1. So that I would be better to run for Senate, win, help my party and the population I care about have the Senate on their side. But to do that, you gotta reduce your ego, the temperature of your ego a little bit, and you gotta look at it as overall as a vocation. If you look at things as a career, then you say, well, where should I go? Maybe I can go here, maybe I can go there. If you look at it as a vocation, then you say, what do I do to make the things I care about happen? And if it's not here, then here. And that's one of the things we're lacking in the political realm.
I don't want to take our time because we have very little, but I can't resist. It's almost like you can't lose your job if you've taken time off to have a baby, or you have to come back, right? I mean, I don't know about jury duty. I think you can't fire somebody because they're on jury duty.
Not supposed to be.
So a working person who happens to get elected has a fear then of not getting back to their job. So we have to unionize everybody and have this clause. Anyway, are you more encouraged about the future?
Am I more encouraged about the future? I don't know that I could say that yet. I would say that I'm more encouraged that people are beginning to think about what's necessary to address future problems. That took me a while to say, but and I think that's important if you're in the public policy.
Yeah. And I want one other thing. You would fully support Biden if he wins the primary.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I don't want to leave that impression that you're not.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I would support any Democrat who won the primary. Mm-hmm. My three favorite candidates are Warren, Sanders, and Biden, in no particular order. And any Democrat. You have a
radical suggestion for a ticket.
I did have a radical suggestion. I'm going to say it. I think if Biden's going to be the one, Biden should choose Liz Warren, and she should accept as his vice presidential nominee. Now, if he's not the presidential candidate, then hopefully it would be it would be Warren.
Right. So do you think that eventually we're going to come up with a ticket that makes sense? Are we going
Yes, I do.
Are we going to
yes,
be vulnerable to the increased interest in the representation of all different kinds?
No, I think we are going to come up with a good ticket, and but I'm going to define the we differently than I think you were asking. I'm not sure whether the we is the Democratic Party establishment. I think the we is people, the people.
Yeah.
And I don't like to use that term. It can be trite, but I do. What I'm seeing is that more and more people are paying attention, and more people are getting involved, and that's absolutely what we need.
And that's what I meant when I started, is that I think Donald Trump has helped bring attention to it.
I think you're right about that.
Thank you, Vinny.
Thank you.
I'm going to read your piece and look at the Chief. It's a great newspaper, incidentally.
It is, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.